Okay, here we go. Hi everyone, my name is Rob Canzaneri and I'm the president of the Data Architecture Virtual Chapter, and I'd like to welcome everyone here to our monthly meeting, and I'd like to thank PASS for giving us the opportunity to have these meetings. If you haven't had a chance, log on to PASS, the website, SQL Pass, and check out all the events. They're always having great events, always great speakers, and activities for people to do. They always have like SQL Saturday and other events that are real good to attend that help everyone learn about SQL Server and other topics. Today I have Erin Stellato, and she's joining me to give a presentation on making the leap from Profiler to extended events. And I really want to thank her for coming today and sharing her time to give this presentation. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Erin and let go from there. So I'm going to change. Let's change it over to you. All right.
Okay. So let's go ahead and let me get everything set up. So you guys should be able to see the first pane of my presentation, and I'm just making sure that I have everything set up on my side for what I need. So the only thing I don't see right now is if you have questions. So that might change as someone asks a question. I'm going to guess no one has answered it yet, so I can't see it, or maybe I'm not in the right place. But we're just going to go ahead and move forward. And if you have questions, please ask them, and then we can either pause to answer them, or at the very end, or maybe tomorrow I'll get an email with all the questions and I can answer them. But hopefully we'll figure out how we're going to answer those as we go along. So again, my name is Erin Stellato, and this is a session on making the leap from Profiler to extended events. And I know that this is the data architecture chapter, and so I was like, well, how am I going to tweak this to fit what you guys do? And I asked, well, what are some typical cases where you guys get involved in, where we could use extended events? And it really comes back to troubleshooting, right? And so I didn't tweak this too much. But if you have a question specific to a problem you've run into before, feel free to ask it, and I'll see if I can relate how we would find that with extended events. So I just want to throw that out there to start with. But a little bit about me. My email address is erin@sqlskills.com, and my blog is sqlskills.com/blogs/Erin. If you have questions related to this session, please feel free to email me. That's why I include my email address. I'm on Twitter @Erin Stellato, so feel free to say hello if you're also on Twitter. And I'm a SQL Server MVP, and I also volunteer for PASS. In fact, I used to run another one of the virtual chapters, so I'm a big supporter and advocate of the virtual chapters because of events like these free training sessions. A little bit about SQL Server in case you're not familiar with our company. The team is myself, Glenn Berry, Jonathan Cahias, Kimberly Tripp, and Paul Randall. And we provide instructor-led training, our immersion events, which occur in the U.S. and in the U.K. And actually, there are two the next 2 weeks down in Australia. Paul and Kimberly are there now in Sydney. We also provide online training through Pluralsight, and that's a subscription-based service, which is on a per-monthly basis, and we've got over 20 courses available there. We also do consulting, provide remote DBA services, and we present at conferences such as Intersection and the Summit. And today's session is actually one that I presented at the Summit last fall. But I found that a lot of people are still slowly working their way over to extended events, so this seems to still be a relevant topic, and it's a session that I really enjoy giving because it took me a long time to make the move from Profiler, and so I'm hoping that after this session you'll be ready to kind of make that same move over there. So I just want to go through the goals because extended events is a big change from what we know about Profiler and Trace, and I'm not going to make you an expert today. My colleague Jonathan Cahias has created 2 courses out on Pluralsight about extended events, and those cover 7 hours. 7 hours of content, and we've got 1. So we're just going to get into the basics, and our goals today are to get you introduced to extended events using what you know about Profiler. We'll talk about how you create, start, stop, and drop the event sessions, what information you can capture, what filters you can use, just like you can in a trace, the terminology. We'll also talk about the potential gotchas with extended events, so some things that you're going to need to be aware of. And hopefully by the end you're going to appreciate the power of extended events. Now let's just do a little review about Profiler and Trace to make sure we're all on the same page from the start. Right? Profiler is the UI version of Trace, and I'm sure that's what most of you are familiar with. And you can get a ton of great information. And you can filter on different columns, right? Typically, I bet that when you create a trace, you are definitely setting up a filter, because if you don't, you can definitely impact your production environment. So typically we filter on something like reads or duration or CPU. And you can automate trace so that it starts automatically, so that it stops automatically. You can take that data and load it into a table and query it. And usually if I'm giving this session live, I start to see head nods, right? You've taken that data, you've pushed it into a table, you're querying and you're sorting and you're ordering by reads, or maybe you're filtering out a particular table, right, against the text. And if you're still running SQL Server 2008 R2 and below, I will tell you that Trace is still a viable option for you. And just as a tip, there are tools out there to help you analyze that data. And you may have already been using RML utils in ClearTrace. And these are free utilities that are fantastic for analyzing that data. But it can bring down a system if you're not careful, because there's a lot of overhead associated with Profiler and Trace. And here's the whole reason for this session. It's deprecated in 2012. And you may think, well, it's deprecated, but they don't take it away, really, right? It's still there, and it is. We're going to open up Profiler in 2012, and it still works, and just as well as it did before. But they haven't made any improvements to it, and they're not going to make any improvements to it. And so we have to, at some point, embrace this new method of extended events. Now, I will admit that I've avoided extended events for a very long time. Because it came out in SQL Server 2008, and there was a lot of other cool stuff released in 2008, like filtered indexes and statistics, TDE, compression, sparse columns, file stream. There were new data types. There was merge. So extended events was kind of easy to forget about, especially because there was no UI at that time in either 2008 or 2008 R2, unless you installed the extended events add-in. And so just as a note, if you're running 2008 or 2008 R2, and you really want to work with extended events, there is a free add-in for Management Studio that you can download from Codeplex. And there was a lot of new vocabulary, and to shred the data, you had to know XML and XQuery. And there's no third-party utility to analyze the output, and it's very different. And this is hard because, again, Trace and Profiler have been around since SQL Server 7. And that was, if I remember correctly, released in '98. So that's 15, 16 years that we've been using Profiler, and it's what we're so familiar with. And I like to say I grew up on Profiler and I grew up on Perfmon. Right? Those are two tools that I know really well, I've been using for a long time. So shifting away from Profiler, it takes effort. But it's worth it, because this is the replacement tool for Trace. It is not going away. This is where the SQL Server team is investing their time. You can still get a ton of useful information. In fact, you can get more, right? But the same info you can get in Profiler and Trace, you can get here. You can filter, just like you can in Profiler and Trace. You can automate it, and in fact, I'd argue that it's easier to automate. It's got this UI in SQL Server 2012, which is where we're going to focus our time today. You don't have to use XQuery anymore, thank heavens. Now, I was having a conversation with Jamie Thompson yesterday, and he seems to be a big fan of XQuery, but I am not, and so I was very grateful for the UI in 2012. And it's much more lightweight than Profiler and Trace, and we can do more than we could with Trace. And I'm hoping that it's going to change the way that you think about troubleshooting, and this will come over time. This may not happen today, but this will come over time as you get more familiar with it. And it's the only method for tracing new functionality in SQL Server. So this is really important. If you're running 2012 and you're working with column store indexes, or you're looking at 2014 and you're thinking about Hackathon, or you're doing anything with availability groups, there's nothing in Profiler that allows you to do troubleshooting against those new features. You have to use extended events. So if you're thinking about any of that new functionality, you're really going to want to become familiar with extended events. So just a quick slide to talk about what they are, and then the rest of this session is really all demo, because I'm a big fan of seeing, and I could talk for a full hour without a problem, but it's much more fun to actually look at what we can do with extended events. So it's an advanced infrastructure that was available in 2008, and it is part of the SQL OS, and it's extremely flexible in how you can implement it, and it is much more powerful than Trace ever was, and it makes identifying problems a lot simpler. And we've got a lot of functionality, a lot of things that we can do with extended events that we couldn't do before. I've got a couple of them listed here. Right? You can find a stored procedure, and it will only capture information about that stored procedure when it exceeds a previous duration or previous CPU or previous I/O. That's pretty cool. You can only capture the first n executions of an event, and you can do cool things with internals like looking at proportional fill or looking at page splits. These things that I've listed here you couldn't do with Trace or with Profiler. So the last thing that I want to mention before I go into the demo is these are the changes in extended events listed by version. So again, if you're running 2008 R2 or 2008, it's probably convenient for you to still work with Trace. And I say that because not until 2012 did we get all of the events that were available in Trace. So in 2008 and 2008 R2, there is no one-to-one relationship between an event in Profiler and event in extended event. Some of them are there, but not all of them. They are all there as of 2012, and in 2012 you have the UI. Now, if you're not on 2012 yet, I would argue that this session is still applicable for you because you're going to get there eventually. You're going to get to 2012 or 2014, and you're going to need to know extended events. So this is going to be a nice, easy intro into extended events. The current count for 2014 is 761, but again, that may not be final. And this is the point where I survey the audience and I say, how many events do you think there are in Profiler? And that number hasn't changed in any of these releases. But you look at this and you think, okay, there's 625 different events in 2012. How many are there in Profiler? There's only 180. Right? So again, this is why we can do so much more in XE than we can do with Profiler. So I don't know if we have any questions yet before I jump in.
No, I don't have any questions yet, so you can continue on.
Okay. All right. Oh, and you know what? Usually this question comes up, so I'm going to say it right now. The slide deck and the scripts that I'm going to go through, they will be available for download. I will send the link for where they will be available. So you will be able to get them later on. So just to make sure that everybody's clear on that. Okay. Let's go over to Management Studio. You can see Management Studio, okay?
Yes, it's fine.
Perfect. And actually, I lied. We're going to go into Profiler. Right? We're going to start with what we know. So here's Profiler, our tried and true friend. And we're going to go File, New Trace, and we're going to connect to our instance. And if we want to do a trace, I typically, right, we could go under Event Selection, and we could show all events. And you're familiar with this, right? You're familiar with scrolling down. Maybe I want to see something related to locks, or maybe I want to see something down here related to SP completed. Typically, when I'm using Trace, I tend to use a template. So I'm going to start with that today. And I have a template for high read queries. And if I come over to my events, I can see, I should be able to see, that I only have 2 events selected. I have RPC completed selected, and I also have SQL statement completed selected. And I've got show all events here. And if I go to my filters, I have a filter set up on reads, greater than or equal to 10,000. So let's go ahead and run this. And typically, I wouldn't let this run, right? I don't want to run Profiler like this. I don't want to run a trace through Profiler because there's a lot of overhead associated with it. Typically, I run a server-side trace. So what you can do is you set up everything in the UI, and then we export that out to a script trace definition. So let's just save this, and then we're going to go open that in Management Studio. And actually, I already have a file that I've commented which I want to look at. But this is essentially what gets created from Profiler, and you can see it here. Right? This is one that I created almost a year ago, actually. And what I want to do is I want to step through this quickly because I want to talk about what we were looking at in the UI when we were in here, right? And we were looking at our events and how that translates to the T-SQL. And then what we're going to do is we're going to look at the T-SQL for extended events, and that's how we're really going to make the leap. from Trace and Profiler over to extended events. So in Trace, what happens is we create a queue, and we're going to get a trace ID, and we've got our max file size, which defaults to 100 megs. And then we have our SP trace create function, where we pass in that trace ID, where we specify our output file, right? Where do we want this data to be written? And we've got our max file size here. Then what we have is a section called set the events. Now, unless you are really, really smart and you spend a lot of time in books online, you're probably going to have to go look these up, because I don't know these off the top of my head. But this, under set the events, this is where we're selecting what event we want to see and the column that we want to see. So remember, and hopefully I'm not going to flip too fast here, but back in Profiler, we've selected the event of RPC completed, and I've checked the box for application name, for CPU, for database ID, right, for all of these columns. So over here in Management Studio in our query, right, this is SP trace set event, and then my trace ID, and then my event ID of 10 is for RPC completed. And my column ID of 1 here is for text data. And the value of 9 is for client process ID. And 10 is for application name. So you see how this, using the SP trace set event, is how within the script, within the trace, we specify the event in the column. We've got the same thing down here for statement completed, right? This event ID is 41. So this is all of the columns that we're adding for the SQL statement completed event. Okay? Then we're setting the filters. So we've got one filter which gets added automatically for Profiler. We've got another filter here which is for our reads filter. So we're doing SP trace set filter, and our filter is for reads greater than 10,000. And then we go ahead and we start the trace, and then it displays the trace for reference. So if we go ahead and run this right now, we see we get a trace ID of 2. And if I happen to run select from sysfn trace get info, if I run this query, we can see right here that this is our trace. Trace ID of 1 is the default trace, right, which is always running. And then unless we've made some kind of change to our configuration. And then we have trace ID of 2, which is the trace that we've created. All right. Now let's see what this looks like with extended events. And in 2012, there is a script that you can run. And this is a script you can download from a post of Jonathan's. And I'm not going to step through this entire script, but it creates a stored procedure, which is SQL Skills convert trace to extended events. This is specific to 2012. This will not work on 2008 or on 2008 R2, but it does on 2012. And what it does is it takes the trace that you already have running, so we're going to input trace ID of 2, and we're going to specify a session name, and then what it's going to do is it's going to print the output for us, or we can actually also have it run if we want. And it's going to take the existing trace that we have running and create the syntax we need for the extended event session. So let's go ahead and do that. So this is just the script that you're going to run. We're going to execute our stored procedure. Right? We already have our trace running, and trace ID is 2. And you need to have the trace running in order for this to work. We're going to do our session name. We're going to call it XC no filter trace. We want it to print the output, so at print output is 1. But I don't want it to execute because we're going to step through that code. So I have at execute equals 0. So if I go ahead and run this, it gives me this code. And we'll just go ahead and drop that into a new query window. All right, so now it has basically converted my trace into an extended event session. Now I've already got another one of these set up. So what I want to do is I'm going to open that. All right, this is exactly the same thing that I had before. I've just formatted it a little bit, and we're going to look at these side by side. And that's not how I wanted to do it at all. I wanted to do it the other way. I apologize. Vertical. There we go. Much better. I'm hoping that you can all see this clearly. So let's start up here at the top for our profiler trace. And here we go. So I've added this at the beginning of our extended events, which is just this: if it exists, if our event session exists, I want you to drop it. Okay? The first thing we start with is our create event session, and we give our event session a name on the server. Right? And it's kind of like this section over here of create a queue. Then we're going to go down and we're going to skip this section for a second, and we're going to go down here. Right over here on the trace side we have set events. Over here on the extended event side we have add event. So it's a little bit different and it's a little bit easier to read, I think, because we're saying right here add event RPC completed. Right? It's nice and in clear text. Over here we were doing SP trace set event and then the event ID and the column ID. What I've got here is just add event. And then what you'll notice is that I have this action section. Now you can think of these actions here as additional columns that I'm selecting. And many of you are probably looking at that and you're thinking, okay, on the right underneath my actions I only see 6, but on the left for my trace I see like 10 or 12. What's going on here? So for every event in extended events, there are a certain number of fields that it's collecting. And sometimes you'll hear it referred to as its default payload. So RPC completed, by default, is already collecting reads, writes, CPU, duration. You don't have to do anything else to collect those fields. They're already being collected for you. Now, you may want additional columns, more additional fields to be selected. And that's what these actions are. So you can think of actions as additional columns, like we would see in Profiler, to be collected. So in this case, I had application name selected before, so I've got client app name over here. I had client process ID in my trace. I've got client PID over here. Database ID, database ID. Right, so this should make sense now. I've added my event, I've got my action, and now I have my predicate, my where, right, my filter, if you will. So down here over on our trace side, we were setting the filter, and we set this reads filter, remember, of 10,000. It's the same way here, it's just a lot easier to read, where my logical reads are greater than or equal to 10,000. And notice then that I have my next event added. Add event SQL statement completed. I have my additional columns, my actions that I'm adding, and then I have my predicate. Now the cool thing is that over here in our trace, when I set this reads filter, it got applied to every event automatically. Well, over here, I apply this per event. So I could, if I wanted to, apply different filters, different predicates to each event if I wanted to. I don't have to. I've got the same ones here, but I could if I wanted to. So once you've added your events, the last thing we do is we specify our target. And our target is, where is this data going to go? Where do I want it to go? And again, we're working in the same context of what we did in trace. So in trace, right, we wrote out to this file, ctemp data trace file. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to go out to event file, and I've got a file name of xenofiltertrace.xel. XEL is the file extension. I've got a max file size of 100. Hey, that looks familiar. And I've got rollover files. And if you remember when you would set up a Profiler trace, you could specify the number of rollover files. And that's it, right? That is an extended event session right there. Pretty simple, right? So I'll take a moment to make a couple changes here in my configuration and see, do I have any questions at this point? Because I'm not seeing them. Go ahead.
Yeah, I see a couple here.
Okay.
One question is, with extended events, can I add events from the perfmon counters?
I think the question is, when you're in Profiler, you have the ability to import performance data. I think this is what the question is.
Right.
So what you have the ability to do is, if you ran a trace and you ran perfmon at the exact same time, you can open up your trace in Profiler and you can import that perfmon data and look at them side by side. You do not have the ability to do that in extended events. And if that was not the question, then please reword it so that I can make sure to answer it. Do you have any other ones?
Just one more. This one, it says, does BOL list the default payload items for the various events?
Great question. We're going to get to that. And so the question is, in Books Online, if you look at the different events, does it tell you what the default, what the information is that's collected by default? I don't think it's explicitly listed in Books Online, but we're going to be able to see it in the UI. So when we get there, I will show that to you. Any others?
Well, the question on the extended events was exactly what he was looking for.
Okay,
So,
perfect. With perfmon. Okay, perfect. All right, so what I did is I stopped the trace that was running and I deleted the file. And what I'm going to do is I'm now going to run my trace at the same time as I run my extended event session. And I want to take my filter off for this case because on a demo it's not always easy to generate more than 10,000 reads. So we're just going to exclude this filter. But again, in your production environment, you always want to include a filter. But we're going to comment that out, excuse me, in both of them. And now I'm going to go ahead and run this, and we get our trace ID of 2 created. And I'm going to go ahead and run this script to create our extended event session. And so that gets executed successfully. I'm going to go ahead and close both of these. And now what I'm going to open up is our next script, which allows us to do some comparisons between them. So the first set of queries that I want to run are to see what exists for my extended event session and also for my trace. So let's run this. So I'm selecting from server event sessions, and now I can see what event sessions exist. And I'm also running fn trace get info to see what traces are currently running. So for our sessions, you can see that we have 3. We've got system health, always on, and XE no filter trace, which is the one we created. Now the system health session is kind of analogous to the default trace, which is the one down here with a trace ID of 1. They are not exactly the same. There's not a one-to-one relationship in terms of the events that are captured in the default trace and the events that are captured by the system health session. But they work in the same manner in that there's 5 files for the trace, and I think it's 4 for system health, and they roll over, right? So it's not a continuous set of files that's building. They roll over each other. But if you're running SQL Server 2008 or higher, be aware that the system health session is running in your environment. The always-on health is not an active session in my environment because I'm not using any of these features, but it is shipped by default with SQL Server. And then this is the event session that I created, XE no filter trace. So even though these are not all running, they're going to show up here. Now my trace that I created, right, is this one down here with the trace ID of 2. All right, so now let's take a look, and let's make sure that they're both started. I know that I started this one, but I did not start my extended event session. So the syntax to do so is really simple. Alter event session on server, I'm going to set the state to start. So let's go ahead and do that. And now it's running. And if I want to see what event sessions are active, I can query server event sessions and join over to DMXE sessions. And for traces, I can query sys.traces, and I can check on the status to see what's running. So let's go ahead and run both of these. Right? And so I can see right here that my always-on health, the session create time is null, so this is not actively running. But my system health has been running since February 27th, and we just started our XE no filter trace. And then I have my trace and my default trace, which are running. Now what we're going to do is we're going to run a little bit of a workload. And this script is just one that has queries from Books Online. So I have a copy of AdventureWorks 2012 installed, and it's just querying against 2012 using these queries from Books Online. So I've run that twice just to generate a little bit of data. And now we're going to go ahead and stop both of them. So to stop the event session, it's just like starting it, right? Alter event session on server. We're going to say state equals stop. And then for our trace, we're just going to do sp trace set status, specify our trace ID, which is 2, and set the status to 0, which means to stop it. So those are both stopped. And if we would come back, actually, and run this query, these 2 queries again, you'll see that now my XE no filter trace is not running, and my trace ID of 2, which we created, is not running. The last thing that I want to do, which I don't have to do, but I'm going to just show you how to clean these up, is if I want to remove an extended event session, I would do drop event session on server, and that's going to remove it entirely. And for my trace, it's just like my start and my stop, but my status is set to 2, and that removes the definition of the trace entirely. So at this point, they're both gone. If we run this other query one more time, you'll see they're both gone, right? I only have the defaults here. Okay, now let's talk about what you're familiar with. Let's go to the trace that we just captured, and let's open this in Profiler. It should open. Well, let's go this way and do it. Okay. No, I'm not going to roll over. So this is what you're familiar with in terms of your Profiler data, right? You come in here and you open it up and you look at it. But what can you really do in Profiler with this data? I can't sort on it, right? I can click on the column name, but I can't sort. I can move my columns around, right? But that's really not that exciting. I can do a find, right? I have my binoculars. I can do a search and look for sales order header in the text field, for example, right? Okay, but I'm really pretty limited in what I can do. I can scroll, and that's about it. And you've probably spent some time right in here like scrolling, looking for something in particular, and you probably know that that's painful. And what you may do is you may export that out to, actually, where is it? I forget. You can export, I haven't done this in a long time. There we go, save as. You can save it as a trace table. You can push it into a database table. Or you can use one of the free utilities like ClearTrace or RML Utils to do analysis on this. Now, let's take a look at what we get from extended events. We get this XE no filter trace, and it's an XEL file. And you'll notice that this file has all these numbers appended to it. And that is a number that SQL Server is adding automatically. You don't have control over that. And it's the number of seconds since January 1st, 1600, if I remember the date correctly. It's not anything that you have to try to figure out. It's just how SQL Server uniquely identifies each one of those files. And the great thing about this is that when you would go and let's say you set up, let's say you created a trace and you created a job to start a trace automatically and stop it. Well, you know that you had to dynamically generate the name of that trace file every single time. You had to specify what it was. And that wasn't really complicated, but you still had to do that extra work. You don't have to do that anymore in extended events because SQL Server does that for you. So it's just kind of nice, I think. So I'm just going to drag this into Management Studio. And at this moment, you're looking at that data, and I bet you're not impressed, and I wouldn't be either. But let me explain what you're seeing, and let me show you how it gets more impressive. When you open an XEL file, by default, you're only going to see these two columns, name and timestamp. And it's because these two columns are the same for every single event. They're the only two that every single event has. Now, if we want to see the rest of the columns, we click on a row, and down here in the bottom, under the details, we get information. And I know you're still not impressed because you're not going to sit here and click through every row, and you don't have to, because what we can do is we can right-click and we can show the column in the table. Right? Right-click, show this in the table. Let's look at physical reads. Did I already add duration? No. And writes, and let's add our statement. I already added our statement. There we go. So these are the columns that I care about. This is what I want to see. And so now at this moment, I can get it to kind of look like Profiler, right? What we're used to. But this is going to be a lot better than Profiler. Now, you don't have to right-click, show column and table every single time you open an XEL file, because what you can do is you have this display settings up here. Right? So let's just zoom in on this. You've got open, open recent, and save as. What you can do is you can save as, and you can save these settings. Let's go to my C drive and down to temp, settings, favorite. So now, every time I open an XEL file, I can go to Open Recent, and I can open up a pre-saved format that I like, right? It's just a .view setting file. So you can customize these based perhaps on what events you're capturing, but understand that you can customize this how you want. Now what I like here is that I can sort, right? I can rearrange these columns by dragging them just the same way that I could before, but I also have the ability to sort. So I can sort on duration. If I just click on it, you see I now have all the zeros at the top. If I click again, now I'm going to get my highest duration descending. So this is a little bit more friendly, and there's more that we can do with this. You may be wondering if you can push this out to a table, and you can. So you have the Extended Events menu up here, and within my Extended Events menu, I have the option to export to, and I can export this out to a table. I could also export this out to a CSV or to another XEL file. And you might wonder, well, this is already an XEL file. Why do I want to export it to another one? And this is nice because what I can do is I can filter. Right? So I can click on this filter option, and I could filter by time, or I could filter by a field. So maybe I could say, let's see, I want to look at, actually I'm going to filter by time. Or maybe we can do this. Maybe we'll do duration greater than whatever that number is. Okay, so look, now I've filtered my data out. So I had a file and maybe I'd captured data for an entire day and there's actually just a subset of it that I care about. I could filter that down and I could export that to an XEL file or to a table or to a CSV file, share it with someone else. Okay? So kind of nice there. And I can come back into my filter and I can clear all. I can say OK, and I get all of my data back. Okay. I also have the ability to do aggregations. So one of the things that I can do is I can also group, but I want to collect a different set of data before I show you how I can group this output. So I'm going to go and I'm going to close out of this and I'm going to start a new extended event session. But before I move on to that, any questions about what I've shown you thus far?
Yeah, we have a few questions here.
Sure.
One of the questions is the Profiler Trace has a GUI feature, and they're concerned. They want to know if does extended events have the GUI feature too.
That's what we're getting to.
Okay. Another question we have is extended events. It's instant wide. Can they use a filter to limit the scope to a specific database?
Yes, you can. I'll show you how to do that.
Okay. Let's see what other. One more question here I see. They were wondering how to create a script that would be triggered automatically when an event for the machine they're running hits 75% CPU utilization.
Ooh, that's a good one. I think you can do that through an alert. Right, if I do an alert based on a event alert. There is a way to do this. These are my SQL Server ones. There's a way to do this. I don't remember how. Great question. Let me figure that out, and I will write a post on how you do that. Because what you can do, for example, I can't give you the example with CPU, but I'm pretty certain there's a way to do it. I just can't remember what it is. But let's say I wanted a performance condition alert, and let's say it was page life expectancy. Right? Let's say that my normal page life expectancy is 5,000. And I've been noticing that when it drops below 5,000, I have a problem. So I can say when page life expectancy falls below 5,000, there's going to be a response. And the response is we're going to execute a particular job. And what you could do is you can set up an agent job, which I don't have set up right here, but you could set up an agent job which then fires off your extended event session or starts your extended event session. Okay, so for CPU, I know there's a way to do it. I will figure that out and I'll write a post on it. Good question.
Okay.
Anything else?
I think we got it all. I might have skipped a few. We can always, I will email them to you if I miss any.
Okay, perfect. All right, so now we're going to go into the UI. so there were some questions about this, and I understand that it's something that you want to see, so that is the last part of this session. So within SQL Server 2012, under Management, you should now have extended events. And underneath extended events, you've got sessions, and I have, again, always on help and system health. These are the two defaults. Now, you might wonder, okay, I'm in Management Studio 2012. If I connect back to a 2008 or a 2008 R2 instance, will I have this extended events UI? You will not, right? You would need the add-in to do that. So the native UI, which comes with SQL Server 2012, cannot be used with an older version. It's only for 2012. All right, so let's go ahead now and let's step through creating an event session through the UI. So we did it with T-SQL before. Now we're going to do this with the UI. And you have the option here of New Session Wizard and New Session. New Session Wizard doesn't give you all the same options as New Session. And so I tend to go with New Session. So we're going to right-click New Session, and we need to give it a name. So we're going to call this Capture Queries. And remember, when we were in Profiler, we had the option to use a template to start off from. We have the same ability in Extended Events, and these are the default templates that are included with Extended Events. You can, just like in Profiler, create your own and add them here. You have the ability to start the event session when the instance starts. So that's pretty powerful. We didn't have the ability to do that automatically unless you scripted it out when the instance started in Trace. Here, you have the ability for it to do that automatically. After we're done creating this, we can also have this start. We're not going to do that today. And then there's an advanced option down here called causality tracking. We're not going to have time to get to that today, but there are several good blog posts that explain how it works. So I need to do a SQL session, I think, to talk about that. SQL as in S-E-Q-U-E-L. Sorry. Okay, events. Right. Once I've specified my session name and any of these other options, I'm going to go to my events. Now these are all the events available. Remember, I told you that as of SQL Server 2012, there's 600 and some, and this is a lot to scroll through. And remember, back here in Profiler, if you looked at a session and you went to event selection, right? This was a pain to scroll through as well, right? And how many times were you like, you know, where is that event that I know it's in here somewhere, but I can never remember where it is, right? You've probably spent a lot of time doing that. I know I have. I've wasted many important minutes of my life. You don't have to do that anymore in extended events, because if we want RPC completed, I can just type RPC completed, and you'll see that it gets that for me automatically. And so I can highlight it, and over here I can just select that event. And the other event that I cared about, right, was statement completed, and I can't spell statement, as you probably guessed already. So we're going to select SQL statement completed, and I can add that. I can add however many events that I want, but the same rule of thumb that we had with Profiler kind of holds true here, right? The more events that you add, the more overhead you're adding. Now, extended events is more lightweight than Trace, but you can still, excuse me, affect your performance in your environment. So you still need to be smart about what you're capturing. I want to minimize this in the background. There we go. So now that I have my events selected, I need to configure the events. And this is my only beef that I'm about to show you with this UI. From here, in order to see what additional fields I can capture, my actions, right, in order to set up my predicate, I have to click on this configure button right here. Okay? So when I click on configure, there's going to be, it's like a transition in PowerPoint. Ready? Right, you see how it moved over? And if I want to go back, I select, and it goes back. So this is the only thing I don't love about the UI, but I can really get past it for all the great benefits. So I've got my events selected, and now I want to configure them. And the question was, what are the fields that are selected by default for an event? You find that right here in Event Fields. Right? This tab right here will tell you. And they won't be the same, obviously, for every event. In fact, just for fun. Let's just add one more that I don't care about, but I want to show you how they change. So let's say I've got missing column statistics. I'm going to add that. So now that I'm looking at this, right, you can see the event fields here are just column list. But for RPC completed, I get CPU, data stream duration, logical reads versus physical reads, row count, statement writes. Right? For SQL statement completed, columns are slightly different. I'm going to take this one off because I don't want it in our. Okay, so this is how you would see the default payload. This is how you would see what fields are going to be included by default. If you want to add additional fields, that's where you're selecting what you'll hear called actions. And I can select these individually, or I could select both of my events and add it. And if I wanted to filter on database ID, I could. Right? I can add, excuse me, if I want to include database ID as a column in my output, I can. If I want to filter on it, I'm going to go to the Filter tab. And here I can do the same thing. I can add my filters individually, or I can select both of these and add my filter. And I can filter on database ID here, and I can say equals 12, which I think is my database ID for AdventureWorks. So I can include that filter. I can also filter on reads. Reads greater than 10,000. I can do and I can do ors. This is where extended events becomes really powerful, right? I can filter in a way that I really couldn't filter before. And extended events, the filter will short circuit as soon as a criteria is not met. For example, I can include database ID equal to 12 and logical reads greater than 10,000. So a query comes in and SQL Server is looking at saying, am I capturing for this event? Am I capturing for RPC completed? I am. Okay, so I'm going to get the event information, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to look to see if I have any predicates, and if so, I need to see if they're met or not. So the first thing it does is says, well, is database ID equals 12? And if it is, then it evaluates the next one. Is the logical reads greater than 10,000? It's not, so it's not going to capture that event. Next, RPC completed comes in. We're checking for RPC completed. I've got it. Is my database ID equal to 12? No. Done. Doesn't even evaluate the reads, right? So this short circuit logic is great where you want to make sure that when you're setting up your predicate, when you're setting up this filter, you want to put what is going to narrow down your result set the most. You want to put that earlier in the predicate, first perhaps. Now one more thing I want you to be aware of with regard to your predicate. Remember I said that the event fields, which are over here, this is the default payload. So this means that when the RPC event fires, and if we're capturing it, it pulls that information. This information automatically is pulled with the event. When I have an action, this is additional information that it has to collect. When I have a filter, and I filter on a field that is not part of my default payload, it then has to go get that value in order to evaluate on it. So in this case, I have database ID first, which is not part of my default payload, right? It's a global field. So it has to go get that information first and check it, which is an extra step. Versus if I had logical reads first, right? That's part of the default payload. Now, if the logical reads were met, right? If I had logical reads first, which I can do this. No, I didn't want to do that. Let's remove that. I can move this up. Let's change this. Logical reads greater than 10,000, right? If this is met, then it's going to have to go get it's going to have to go check my additional predicates. So I'm hoping that when you're creating these filters, because again, we always want to filter on something, think about the order of them because it does matter. All right, so we're going to do logical reads greater than 10,000, which is what we had before. Let's delete all these extra things that I kept clicking and adding. And we've got our default payload, and we've got some global fields selected. Then we're going to decide on our data storage. This is our target, right? Where are we going to write that information? And we talked about event file, right? So if I want to specify event file, I'm going to write this out to C temp data, capture queries. My maximum file size, 1 gig. I'm going to enable file rollover with a maximum size of 5, right? You can configure this depending upon your space requirements and availability. Now, I also have another target that I'm going to mention here, which is the ring buffer. So rather than writing the information out to a file, I could push it into the ring buffer. I could push it into memory. And in order to read that data from memory, I have to parse it, and it's in XML. So if you're familiar with that, if you're familiar with XQuery and how to do that, you could push the information to the ring buffer. But one of the things to pay attention to here is that it's a first in, first out queue. So as events come in, it's going to fill up the buffer, the space that you've allocated, and then once it gets full, it's going to age out the older events. So for most of your troubleshooting, you're probably going to use event file. But I want you to be aware that ring buffer is an option. And I typically do set a maximum buffer size here of 4 megs, just as the default. I'm not going to go through the advanced options today. Again, there's more information available in books online or in the resources that I'll provide in the slide deck. So we'll go ahead and we'll say OK. And now we've got our event session. And we can always, just as we can in so many other places within Management Studio, I can script this out. And this doesn't look quite as pretty as what I had before. But I've got my create event sessions, I've got my add events, I've added an additional action, additional column, I've got my predicate where logical reads greater than 10,000. I have my second event, again action, my where. I've got 2 targets, my event file, and I've also got my ring buffer. All right, now what I'm going to do is I've modified this slightly, and I'm going to recreate this. So not what I wanted to click on. Execute. And we're going to go ahead and we're going to start this. And now what I want to do is run a couple scripts, some PowerShell scripts, which are going to run queries against our databases here. And at this point, the other thing that I can do, which is kind of cool, is I can watch my data live. So this isn't going to work quite the same way as Profiler did. Right? I'm writing out to a file and it's writing to memory, but I can also have the data come into this window here and watch it live. And now those of you that know about the performance impact of Profiler, you might start thinking, well, wait, is this a bad thing to do? This is okay because SQL Server has a built-in mechanism to actually stop the live feed if it does impact performance. And there's a maximum number of rows that it will show in this view. So I will do this for a short amount of times, perhaps to make sure that I'm getting the right set of data. I don't tend to leave this open the entire time, but there are cases where it's useful to look at the data as it's coming in. And what I can do, which I can stop this, so my extended event session is still running, right? My scripts are still running, it's still collecting data, but maybe I just want to look at this set of data that I have right here. I have the ability to do that. Now, in our event session definition, if you remember, I wrote data not just out to the file, but I also said to go to the ring buffer. Querying the ring buffer is time-consuming, and it's expensive. But one of the things that I want you to be aware of is that if I've set it up so that my target is the ring buffer, I can stop my event, I can stop collecting an event, and the information will still be in the ring buffer. So I'm going to go ahead and run that query. And actually, we also had RPC completed, right? Let's drop that as well. So at this point, oh, I didn't have it in this one. At this point, if I come back here to my live data and I start it up again, you're going to see that I don't get any more data coming in here. And it's because even though my event session is still running, right, you can see that it's still running, I have removed the events from the event session So they're no longer being captured. But my data still exists in the ring buffer, and I can query it using xquery. And this is not my code, I admit. Again, remember I told you I don't love it. But you can see that when I start to query it, it's going to take a while for information to start to return. It'll come back, but this is not really quick. I would prefer to work with the flat file. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop this, and now what I'm going to do is stop my event session entirely. And the moment that I stop my event session, if I come back here, by the way, that error that I got, the error came up because I was looking at live data, and so when I stop the event session, it throws the error to say, you had live data going, but you're not going to have it anymore because you just stopped it. Sorry, I should have showed you that message. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to run the query against the ring buffer again to query it, and you'll see that I get absolutely nothing back. So when I altered the event session and I dropped the event, I could still query the XML. But the moment that I actually stopped the session, that data is gone from the ring buffer. So another reason probably to write out to the file is so that you can look at that data later on. And so let's do that really quick as we're about to wrap up. Let's see, my second one, here it is. I wanted to show you how we could group, right? So let's say physical reads, let's look at logical reads, let's look at duration, and let's look at the statement itself. Right? One of the things that you probably often do when you are looking at this data is you might sort on duration. Right? What are the queries that I have here that have the highest duration? And it's, you can see over here, you've got the bar on the right. It's going along. It's taking a little bit because I captured about 70,000 events or so. So it's taking a little bit to sort them. Right? But I could sort on duration, or I could sort on reads. And typically when you're looking at a performance issue, right, that might be what you do. Right? And I can see down here at the bottom, here are the highest durations. But sometimes your worst performing, your queries that are affecting performance the most aren't necessarily the ones that have the highest number of reads or take the longest amount of time. It may be those that run over and over and over again. And we call those the death by 1,000 cuts. And so one of the things you could do in here, which you couldn't do in Profiler, is I can right-click and I can group by a column. And so for my parameterized queries, for my stored procedures, right, now I can get these grouped. And I know there's a lot of text here, so just take 1 second here and look at this. If I look here, right, I've got these different queries, right? So here's a select from sales order detail, left out or join. Here's a select from person.person. Here's a select from sales order detail. And this one, if you'll notice, runs 67,000 times. And I've got a select from production work order. And so if I look at these, and I look to see how many times these are running, this is 976, 852, 772, but hey, this one runs 67,000 times. That might be of concern to me. Right? And then the other thing that I can do is I can do aggregations within here. So if I wanted to calculate an average duration, I can do that, and it shows me my average duration. Or perhaps I wanted to look at physical reads, and I'm going to calculate the aggregation here for the max. Right? So you have a lot more, and actually there was no physical reads. Everything's sitting in memory. Let's try it over here for logical reads. Right? I can get more information in here in the UI than I could with Profiler. So we're right up against 2 o'clock. Are there any last questions that I could answer?
Let's see.
Before everybody has to run back.
Let's see, what do I have here? One person is asking, can you write directly to a table instead of a file?
You cannot, and you would not want to do that because it's a huge performance hit.
Okay. I'll email you more questions.
Okay.
And
Awesome.
I'm getting a lot of great thank yous, and I'll email them to you too. So thank you, Erin.
No problem. If you have questions, just put them in now, or you can email me directly. Again, Erin@SQLskills.com. Happy to hear from you, and thank you for the chance to present today. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Erin. I really appreciate you coming today and taking your time, and I hope you have a great weekend. Thank you.
Thanks. You too. Take
All
care,
right.
all.
All right, bye.